The Trump administration is turning back to the Supreme Court to protect the president's travel ban, appealing a ruling by a federal judge in Hawaii that vastly expands the definition of close family members exempt from the ban and potentially allowing in thousands more refugees. Let's bring in now trial attorney Rachel Self and defense attorney Richard St. Paul to debate this. Richard, I'll start with you. Was this the right judgment by Judge Watson of Hawaii to expand the exemptions to allow close relatives of U.S. citizens to visit their family? And as we said, it also applies to refugees already being processed by resettlement agencies. How do you see it, Richard?
Absolutely not. Look, Congress gave the president the power to determine when and who can come into this country. And the judge expanding this definition is out of the context of what the constitutional powers are for this particular judge. I'll give you an example. In this country, in order to immigrate to the country, there are certain factors of which you can immigrate here. If it's a family member, it has to be a parent, a sibling, a spouse, fiance. That's how you get into this country. Not a grandparent, not a cousin, not the third uncle.
Rachel, how do you see it?
So I disagree with Richard on this, Arthel, and the reason is because the Supreme Court was very clear in its ruling of who the travel ban was going to apply to. These aren't necessarily people trying to immigrate here. These are people trying to visit here. And the Supreme Court said that people who had a bona fide relationship to a person or entity in the United States would not have to suffer the effects of the ban. So what you're dealing with, bona fide is defined, okay? It means real or genuine connection. So a real or genuine connection with a person or entity within the United States is somebody who will not be affected by the ban. What the administration then did is they said, well, no, let's redefine bona fide. And that's where you're running into some issues. Bona fide is already defined, and to start to limit it is not appropriate.
So, Richard, getting back to you, is this a legal fight worth fighting by the DOJ, or might some consider it to be more peacocking by that camp for the president's political base?
No, absolutely. It is a legal fight, and this is the reason why. Because, again, you're trying to have a federal judge limit the presidential power. And the question, to Rachel's point, the question remains is, can the Trump administration determine what bona fide is? They absolutely can. Congress gave the president the power to restrict travel among immigrants or any alien, is what the legislation says, in the world, if he deems it so necessary.
So, Rachel, how...
Yes, but
Go ahead.
No, well, what I was going to say is that there's an arbitrary and capricious application being made here, because to say that a grandmother is a less bona fide relationship than a fiance is simply nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense. Bona fide means real or genuine. So is the grandmother fake? Is the fiance real? It doesn't make any sense. The Supreme Court was very clear in their ruling that when they used the word bona fide, and bona fides is not a new concept in immigration law. You need to prove that you have a bona fide marriage in order to get a marriage immigration benefit. Bona fide is clear. It means real or genuine. That's like saying to somebody, look, if you have hair, you can enter the United States. And the administration is saying, no, you have to have short hair or red hair. And it simply doesn't make sense. And it's good for the Supreme Court to revisit it.
The question is whether or not the Supreme Court gets to determine bona fide, or does the president get to determine it. Under the immigration laws now, you cannot come in this country. You cannot have a sponsor if they're a grandparent, if they're an uncle or cousin. Wouldn't you agree with that, Rachel, right? You would agree with that.
I would, but we're not
exactly.
I would, but we're not talking about sponsorship, Richard. You're splitting. You're talking about two very different things. What we're talking about here is limiting a person being able to enter the United States by being affected by this travel ban, not necessarily immigrating here, but simply coming here to visit when they already have a visa or they already have a resettlement in place.
And I'm saying the Trump administration is using that definition.
Rachel, let me ask you then, how does Hawaii need to reply in order to convince the Supreme Court to uphold Hawaii's exceptions to the travel ban?
Well, I think Rachel's making that particular argument, and bona fide is anybody who actually has a family connection. But it's not up to the federal judge to determine that. It's up to the Trump administration to determine it.
Okay, Rachel, go ahead.
It's absolutely not up not solely to the Trump administration, though. We have separation of powers. We have the judicial branch. The Supreme Court defined who this ban should be applying to. And the Hawaiian judge said, well, wait a second. The administration's not allowed to now start defining what family is and all that when the Supreme Court's ruling already said what the connection needed to be. It doesn't need to be family.
But
it needs
Rachel,
to be an entity or a person within the United States.
These federal court judges have been trying to stop the president from doing his job, from keeping the country safe, and they've all been overruled by the Supreme Court. And I think this is going to be another win for the Trump administration, and that he gets to determine who is bona fide.
No, because what's interesting is this being touted as some big win. When the Supreme Court made this decision on the travel ban issue, it came out by the Trump administration as this was some great victory. It actually, if it's applied appropriately and the Supreme Court's ruling is followed, it doesn't affect that many people. The Supreme Court's ruling wasn't some great victory because most people can prove a bona fide connection to the United States via person or entity.
And Rachel,
so it's going to be very interesting what comes down here when we see this develop.
We'll continue to watch it. Rachel Self, Richard St. Paul, thank you very much for the debate. See you guys
Always a
again.
pleasure, Othello.
Take care.
Thank you,
same here.
guys. Have a good night.